Welcome. I am so glad you're here to join me for this exploration of a truly life-changing perspective. Have you ever looked at someone who is incredibly successful, maybe a world-class athlete, a brilliant musician, or a tech genius, and thought to yourself, I could never do that. I just wasn't born with that kind of talent. It is a very common feeling. Most of us go through life believing that greatness is something you are either born with or you aren't. We see talent as a sort of magical gift handed out at birth to a lucky few, while the rest of us are left to just get by with what we have. But what if I told you that this way of thinking is not only wrong, but it is actually the very thing holding you back from your own greatness? That is exactly what we're going to dive into today. The main purpose of this book is to completely dismantle the idea that success is down to natural talent, and to show you that being awesome is actually a process, a journey that anyone can choose to take if they have the right mindset. Throughout this summary, we're going to look at a few high-level ideas that form the foundation of this shift in thinking. First, we will explore the talent myth and why our obsession with innate ability is actually a trap. Second, we will look at the incredible power of the growth mindset, which is the belief that your brain is like a muscle that can be grown and strengthened through effort. And finally, we will discuss the importance of how we view failure, not as a dead end, but as the most essential fuel for your future success. In You Are Awesome, Matthew Syed invites you to stop looking at the world as a place divided into naturals and nobodies, and to start seeing it as a place of endless possibility. It is a guide for anyone who wants to break free from the fear of not being good enough and start building the life they actually want. By the time we finish this session, you will see that the path to greatness isn't reserved for the elite. It is open to you, provided you are willing to change the way you think about your own potential. If you find this summary helpful and want to see more content like this to help you on your personal growth journey, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Main summary: the path to greatness and the growth mindset. The first core idea we need to address is the fundamental misunderstanding most people have about success, which is often referred to as the talent myth. This is the belief that top performers in any field reach the summit of their profession primarily because of biological advantages or natural gifts. We tend to look at the finished product, the Olympic gold medalist or the concert pianist, and we are so dazzled by their skill that we assume they were simply born that way. We use the word talented as a way to explain away their success, which, perhaps unintentionally, gives us an excuse not to try as hard ourselves. After all, if they were born great and we weren't, why bother putting in the work? However, the book argues that this focus on talent is incredibly misleading. When you look closely at the history of high achievers, you don't find people who were born perfect. You find people who had an extraordinary amount of practice and the right environment to nurture their skills. Success is far less about what you are born with and far more about the hours you are willing to put in and the way you approach your practice. By debunking the talent myth, we reclaim our own agency. We realize that if success is built rather than inherited, then the ceiling on our own potential is much higher than we ever imagined. It shifts the focus from what am I to what can I become. This is a vital realization because it removes the invisible barriers we place on ourselves before we even start. Now we move to the next point, which builds on the idea of moving past the talent myth by examining the specific internal framework that allows us to grow: the growth mindset. The growth mindset is perhaps the most critical concept for understanding how anyone becomes awesome. This idea, rooted in the research of Carol Dweck and expanded upon here, contrasts two very different ways of viewing yourself: the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. People with a fixed mindset believe that their intelligence, character, and creative ability are static givens, traits they are simply stuck with. To them, success is an affirmation of that inherent intelligence. Because they believe their traits are fixed, they often avoid challenges where they might fail, because failure would suggest they aren't actually smart or talented. This leads to a life of playing it safe and staying within a very narrow comfort zone. On the other hand, the growth mindset is the belief that your basic qualities are things you can cultivate through your efforts. Although people may differ in every which way, in their initial talents and aptitudes, interests, or temperaments, everyone can change and grow through application and experience. This mindset is important because it changes the very meaning of difficulty. For someone with a growth mindset, a challenge isn't a threat to their ego. It's an opportunity to get smarter. They understand that the brain is like a muscle. It actually physically changes and creates new neural connections when we struggle with something new or difficult. Think of it like learning to ride a bike. No one is born knowing how to balance on two wheels. You fall, you wobble, and your brain is working overtime to figure out the physics of it. Each time you fail and try again, your brain is literally rewiring itself to get better at that specific task. If you had a fixed mindset, you might fall once and say, "I guess I'm just not a bike rider." But with a growth mindset, you realize that the falling is actually part of the learning. This mindset is the engine that drives progress because it makes you resilient in the face of setbacks. Instead of seeing a no or a failure as a verdict on your worth, you see it as data that helps you adjust your strategy for the next attempt. Now we move to the next point, which takes the theory of the growth mindset and applies it to the practical reality of how we actually develop world-class skills through purposeful practice. While having the right mindset is the foundation, it isn't enough on its own. You also have to understand how to practice effectively. The book introduces the concept that not all practice is created equal. Many of us spend years doing the same thing over and over again, whether it's playing a sport, a musical instrument, or a job task, but we never actually get much better. This is because we are engaging in autopilot practice. We stay within our comfort zone, doing the things we're already good at. To become truly awesome, you must engage in what is known as purposeful or deliberate practice. Purposeful practice is about pushing yourself just beyond your current abilities. It is the uncomfortable zone where you are stretching your skills and making mistakes. The importance of this cannot be overstated. If you aren't making mistakes, you aren't practicing effectively. High achievers don't just put in the hours, they put in quality, hours where they are focused on specific goals and seeking immediate feedback. They break down complex skills into small, manageable pieces and work on the weakest parts until they become strengths. This is often where the 10,000-hour rule comes into play. But the book clarifies that it's not just about the number of hours. It's about the intensity and the focus of those hours. A relatable example would be a basketball player who spends an hour just shooting random hoops versus a player who spends 20 minutes specifically practicing their weak, left-handed layup from 5 different angles, recording their success rate, and adjusting their footwork every time they miss. The second player will improve exponentially faster because they are targeting their weaknesses and forcing their brain to adapt. This type of practice is demanding and often frustrating, but it is the only way to achieve true mastery. It requires a willingness to look bad in the short term so that you can become awesome in the long term. Now we move to the next point, which addresses the biggest obstacle to purposeful practice: our fear of failure and how we must learn to embrace it. If we want to practice at the edge of our ability, we have to accept that we will fail often. In our society, failure is frequently treated as something shameful, something to be hidden or avoided at all costs. But the book argues that this perspective is completely backwards. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is a vital component of it. In fact, failure is described as information or fuel. Every time you get something wrong, you have just discovered one way that doesn't work, which moves you one step closer to the way that does. The most successful people in the world are often those who have failed the most. This is because they aren't afraid to take risks, and they don't let a loss define them. They use failure as a diagnostic tool. When something goes wrong, they ask, "Why did this happen? And what can I change next time?" This is a radical shift in perspective. Instead of seeing failure as a wall, you start seeing it as a series of stepping stones. This is important because it removes the paralyzing fear of, "What if I mess up?" When you realize that messing up is actually the mechanism that makes you better, you become unstoppable. You start to seek out challenges because you know that even if you fail, you will come out the other side with more knowledge and a stronger brain than you had before. This understanding of failure leads us directly into a practical tool that helps bridge the gap between where you are now and where you want to be. Now we move to the next point, which is the simple but transformative power of a single word: yet. The word yet is the ultimate linguistic switch for a growth mindset. In the book, Syed explains how our internal monologue often shuts down potential before we even give ourselves a chance. When we encounter a difficult task, our instinct is often to say, "I can't do this," or "I'm not good at this." These are closed statements. They function like a locked door, signaling to your brain that the journey is over and there's no point in continuing to exert effort. By adding the word "yet" to the end of those sentences, you fundamentally change the chemistry of your thought process. "I can't do this yet," or "I'm not good at this yet," transforms a static declaration of failure into a temporary state of progress. This is important because it keeps the door to learning open. It acknowledges your current struggle without making it a permanent part of your identity. It reminds you that mastery is a function of time and effort, not a fixed trait. This small shift in language helps prevent the fixed mindset from taking over during moments of frustration. It allows you to stay in the game long enough for your brain to start making the connections it needs to succeed. It's a way of being honest about your current limitations while remaining optimistic about your future capabilities. Now we move to the next point, which explores the specific space where this growth actually happens, understanding the difference between your comfort, stretch, and panic zones. To become awesome, you have to be very strategic about where you spend your energy. The book describes 3 distinct zones of activity. The first is the comfort zone. This is where you do things you are already good at. It feels safe and easy, but the problem is that no growth happens here. If you only ever play the songs you already know on the guitar, you will never become a better musician. You are simply maintaining your current level. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the panic zone. This is where a task is so far beyond your current ability that you feel overwhelmed, anxious, and paralyzed. In this zone, your brain is too stressed to learn anything, and you are likely to give up out of pure frustration. The sweet spot for improvement is the stretch zone, sometimes called the growth zone. This is the area just outside your comfort zone where the task is difficult enough to be challenging, but not so hard that it's impossible. This is where you are fumbling, making those necessary mistakes, and forcing your brain to adapt. The key to long-term success is learning how to live in the stretch zone as much as possible. It requires a certain level of comfort with being uncomfortable. By constantly identifying where your stretch zone is and moving into it, you gradually expand your comfort zone. What was once difficult eventually becomes easy, allowing you to move on to even greater challenges. Now we move to the next point, which addresses the social and psychological barriers we face, specifically the illusion of the natural. One of the reasons we find it so hard to commit to the stretch zone is that we are constantly bombarded with stories of natural geniuses. We see a child prodigy on television or a young tech billionaire, and we assume they just woke up that way. The book points out that we actually prefer the myth of the natural over the reality of the hard worker. Why? Because if someone is a natural, we don't have to compare ourselves to them. Their success is a result of magic, so our lack of success isn't our fault. However, if we acknowledge that their success is the result of thousands of hours of grueling, focused practice, then we have to face the uncomfortable truth. We could potentially achieve great things too, but we haven't put in the work. This natural label is actually quite damaging, both to the observer and the person being labeled. When we call a child a natural at math, we accidentally push them into a fixed mindset. They start to value their gift more than their effort. They become afraid to tackle hard problems, because if they struggle, it might prove they aren't a natural after all. Syed argues that we should stop praising talent and start praising process, effort, and strategy. When we value the work that goes into an achievement, we create a culture where everyone feels they have the potential to improve. It demystifies success and makes it something attainable through persistence, rather than the lottery win of genetics. Now we move to the next point, which delves into the physical reality of how our brains change, specifically the role of myelin. It is often helpful to understand that the growth in a growth mindset isn't just a metaphor. It is a physical process happening inside your head. The book touches on the science of how we learn skills through the development of myelin. Think of your brain's neural pathways like wires. When you perform an action, an electrical signal travels along these wires. Myelin is a fatty substance that wraps around these neural pathways, acting like insulation on a copper wire. The more you practice a specific skill, especially when you are in that stretch zone, the more myelin builds up around those specific circuits. The thicker the myelin, the faster and more accurately the signals travel. This is why a professional athlete can react to a ball in milliseconds. Their neural pathways for that action are so heavily insulated with myelin that the signal moves at lightning speed. This is important because it proves that talent is actually a physical buildup in the brain caused by repetition and struggle. You aren't born with these insulated pathways. You build them. Understanding this can be incredibly motivating because it turns learning into building. You aren't just trying to remember something. You are physically constructing a more efficient brain through your practice. Now we move to the next point, which discusses the role of feedback and why being wrong is the fastest way to get it right. In the journey to becoming awesome, feedback is your most valuable resource. However, many of us have a complicated relationship with feedback because we view it as criticism. In a fixed mindset, being told you did something wrong feels like an attack on your character. But in a growth mindset, feedback is simply the data you need to adjust your myelin building process. The book emphasizes that the best learners are those who actively seek out feedback, especially the kind that highlights their weaknesses. Without feedback, you are essentially practicing in the dark. You might be repeating the same mistake over and over again, effectively myelinating a bad habit. To avoid this, you need a way to see the gap between what you are doing and what you should be doing. This could come from a coach, a teacher, a peer, or even self-observation through recording yourself. The faster the feedback loop, the faster you improve. If you make a mistake and immediately realize why, you can correct it on the next repetition. This is why purposeful practice is so exhausting. It requires constant, high-level concentration on the feedback you are receiving from your environment and your own results. Now we move to the next point, which looks at the concept of marginal gains and how small, incremental changes lead to massive long-term results. When we look at a massive goal, like becoming a professional writer or a champion athlete, the distance between where we are and where we want to be can feel overwhelming. This is where many people give up because the mountain seems too high to climb. Syed introduces the idea of marginal gains, which is a philosophy of looking for a tiny 1% improvement in everything you do. Instead of trying to change everything at once, you focus on making very small, manageable adjustments to different parts of your process. The math of marginal gains is powerful. If you improve by just 1% every day, those gains compound over time. By the end of a year, you aren't just 365% better because of the way improvements build on top of each other. You are exponentially more capable. This approach takes the pressure off. You don't have to be awesome tomorrow. You just have to be 1% better than you were today. It makes the journey toward greatness feel sustainable. It turns the focus away from the intimidating final goal and places it on the daily process. Whether it's tweaking your morning routine, practicing your scales for 5 more minutes, or refining one specific paragraph, these tiny wins eventually add up to a world-class performance. Now we move to the next point, which addresses the necessity of grit and perseverance when the newness of a task wears off. Starting a new hobby or project is usually exciting. The initial progress often comes quickly, and the novelty keeps us motivated. But eventually, everyone hits a plateau. This is the boring middle section where the easy gains are gone and the work becomes repetitive. This is where most people quit. The book argues that awesomeness is reserved for those who have grit, the ability to keep going when the excitement has faded and the work feels like a grind. Grit is the result of having a why that is stronger than the temporary discomfort of the how. People with a growth mindset are more likely to have grit because they don't see a plateau as a sign that they've hit their limit. They see it as a sign that they need to change their strategy or increase their intensity. They understand that the grind is actually where the most significant myelin building happens. Persistence isn't just about stubbornly doing the same thing. It's about staying committed to the goal while being flexible about the methods. It's the willingness to show up day after day, even when you don't feel like it, because you trust the process of incremental growth. Now we move to the next point, which examines the power of environment and how the people around us shape our potential. While mindset and practice are internal, the book also highlights how our external environment plays a massive role in our success. We often think of great achievers as lone wolves who succeeded in spite of their surroundings, but the reality is usually the opposite. Success tends to cluster in specific places and times. Think of the Renaissance in Florence or Silicon Valley today. This is because excellence is contagious. When you are surrounded by people who have high standards, a growth mindset, and a dedication to practice, those behaviors become your normal. Your environment acts as a mirror. If everyone around you believes that talent is fixed and failure is shameful, it will be incredibly difficult for you to maintain a growth mindset. But if you surround yourself with people who celebrate effort and view challenges as opportunities, your own growth will accelerate. This means being intentional about who you spend time with and what kind of information you consume. It also means creating a physical environment that supports your goals, one that makes it easy to practice and difficult to get distracted. You are, in many ways, a product of your surroundings, so choosing the right tribe is a strategic move toward becoming awesome. One of the most powerful tools for maintaining this journey is something we often overlook because it happens entirely inside our own heads, our internal monologue. Now we move to the next point, which is the critical role of the inner narrative and self-talk. Every one of us has a voice in our head that narrates our lives. It's that constant stream of thought that comments on what we are doing, how we are performing, and what our chances of success are. And you are awesome. Syed explains that this inner voice is often the primary driver of either a fixed or a growth mindset. If your inner voice is a harsh critic, constantly saying things like, "You're going to embarrass yourself," or "See, you're just not a natural at this," it creates a psychological cage. This negative self-talk isn't just annoying. It actually sabotages your performance by increasing stress and diverting your focus away from the task at hand. The book suggests that we must become the editor of our own thoughts. This means actively listening to that internal voice and challenging it when it slips into fixed mindset territory. Instead of letting a negative thought stand as a fact, you counter it with a growth-oriented response. For example, if you find yourself thinking, "I'm terrible at public speaking," you intentionally rephrase it to, "I haven't mastered the skills of public speaking yet, but every time I practice, I get a little bit more comfortable." This isn't about mindless positive thinking or lying to yourself. It's about being more accurate. Since your brain is capable of change, the statement, "I'm terrible at this," is actually factually incorrect because it implies a permanent state. Changing your inner narrative to reflect the reality of growth is an essential step in building the resilience needed to keep going. Now we move to the next point, which addresses a major external hurdle that often stops people before they even start: the fear of looking stupid. A massive part of why we stay in our comfort zones is our concern with how others perceive us. We are social creatures, and the fear of being judged or laughed at is a powerful evolutionary instinct. However, this fear is the enemy of excellence. To get better at anything, you have to be willing to be bad at it first. You have to be willing to ask the dumb questions, make the clumsy mistakes, and fall down in front of people. The book emphasizes that many people choose a life of mediocrity simply because they are too afraid of the temporary embarrassment that comes with being a beginner. Syed encourages listeners to realize that most people are actually far more concerned with their own performance and their own looking stupid than they are with yours. When we see someone working hard and failing, our instinct is often to admire their effort, yet we assume the world will judge us harshly for doing the same. Overcoming this hurdle requires a shift in values. You have to value your own growth and your future awesomeness more than the fleeting opinions of people who might see you struggle. By embracing the clumsy stage of learning, you gain a competitive advantage over everyone else who is too scared to try. This willingness to look uncool in the short term is what eventually leads to the mastery that everyone else will later call natural talent. Now we move to the next point, which focuses on the tactical side of progress, breaking the big goal into micro steps. When we think about a massive ambition, our brains often experience a freeze response. The gap between our current reality and our ultimate goal feels so vast that it seems impossible to bridge. This is why many people have great ideas, but never take the first step. The book teaches the importance of deconstructing these big dreams into tiny, manageable micro steps. This is the practical application of the marginal gains theory mentioned earlier. Instead of worrying about how to write a 300-page book, you focus entirely on writing one good paragraph today. This approach is important because it provides a series of quick wins that keep your motivation high. Each micro-step you complete releases a small hit of dopamine in the brain, which reinforces the habit of taking action. It also makes the feedback loop much tighter. If you try to tackle a giant goal all at once, it's hard to know where you went wrong if you fail. But if you are working on a micro-step, the error is easy to spot and easy to fix. This method turns a daunting mountain into a series of small, climbable stairs. It's a way of tricking your brain into staying in the stretch zone without accidentally drifting into the panic zone. Success, as Syed defines it, is simply the result of stacking hundreds of these micro-steps on top of each other over a long period of time. Now we move to the next point, which discusses the unexpected necessity of rest, sleep, and brain maintenance. In our hustle culture, we are often told that greatness comes from working 24 hours a day and sacrificing sleep. However, the science of the brain tells a very different story. While hard work and purposeful practice are essential, the actual upgrading of your brain, the process where that myelin we talked about is solidified, happens while you sleep. The book points out that sleep isn't just downtime. It is an active period where your brain processes the information you learn during the day and clears out metabolic waste. If you are practicing hard but not sleeping enough, you are essentially trying to build a house in a storm. You are putting in the effort, but the structure isn't having the chance to set. This is a vital point for anyone trying to become awesome. High performance is a balance of intense stretch zone activity and high-quality recovery. Without the recovery, you eventually hit a point of diminishing returns where your practice becomes autopilot or junk practice because your brain is too tired to maintain the necessary focus. Taking care of your physical health through sleep, nutrition, and movement is not a distraction from your goals. It is the very foundation that allows your brain to stay plastic and capable of growth. Now we move to the next point, which explores the concept of the black box thinking applied to personal life. This concept, which is a major theme in Syed's other work, but deeply integrated here, refers to the way the aviation industry handles mistakes. When a plane crashes, they find the black box, analyze exactly what went wrong, and then change the entire system so that the same mistake never happens again. They don't hide the mistake. They celebrate the learning that comes from it. The book suggests we should treat our own lives like a black box system. When we fail at a task or miss a goal, our first instinct is often to get defensive or feel ashamed. But the awesome approach is to be ruthlessly curious about the failure. Instead of saying, "I'm just not good at this," you ask, what was the specific point where things went wrong? Was it a lack of preparation? Was it a flaw in the strategy? Was it a momentary loss of focus? By treating your life as an ongoing experiment, you remove the emotional sting of failure. It becomes a technical problem to be solved rather than a moral failing. This investigative approach to your own errors ensures that you never make the same mistake twice. It allows you to fail forward at a much faster rate than people who try to ignore or hide their blunders. Now we move to the next point, which addresses the reality of the plateau of despair. In any long-term endeavor, there will come a time when you feel like you've stopped improving. You're putting in the work, you're practicing in the stretch zone, but your results aren't moving. This is often called a plateau. For many, this is the most dangerous part of the journey because it feels like the growth mindset has failed. The book warns that these plateaus are a natural part of the learning curve. Sometimes, your brain needs a period of consolidation where it is integrating new skills before it can jump to the next level of performance. The key during a plateau is not to give up, but to look at it as a consolidation phase. It's a time to stick to the process and perhaps slightly vary your practice to keep your brain engaged. Syed explains that many people quit just before a major breakthrough because they interpret the plateau as their natural limit. But in a growth mindset, there is no such thing as a natural limit, only temporary pauses in progress. Understanding that the plateau is part of the awesome process helps you maintain the grit needed to push through to the other side, where the next surge of growth is waiting. Now we move to the next point, which looks at the importance of perspective and the big picture. Becoming awesome is a long game. It is easy to get caught up in the day-to-day frustrations, the bad practice session, the failed test, the negative feedback. The book encourages listeners to step back and look at their journey from a wider perspective. When you look at your progress over the course of a day, it might look like a flat line, but when you look at it over the course of a year, you can see the upward trend. This big-picture thinking is essential for maintaining motivation. It also helps to keep your why in focus. Why do you want to master this skill? Why do you want to change your mindset? When the how gets difficult, remembering the why provides the emotional fuel to keep going. Whether it's to provide a better life for your family, to fulfill a childhood dream, or simply to see what you are truly capable of, having a clear purpose acts as an anchor. It reminds you that the struggle in the stretch zone isn't just random pain. It is a meaningful investment in the person you are becoming. This long-term view helps you stay calm during the inevitable ups and downs of the learning process. As we bring our journey through the insights of You Are Awesome to a close, it is worth taking a moment to reflect on the radical shift in perspective we have explored. We began by challenging one of the most deeply held myths in our culture, the idea that greatness is a gift granted at birth to a select few. We have seen how this talent myth acts as a psychological anchor, keeping us tethered to a limited view of our own potential. But by dismantling that myth, we have cleared the way for a much more exciting reality. The core message Matthew Syed leaves us with is that being awesome is not a destination you reach because you were born with a map. It is a path you choose to walk every single day. It is a process of intentional growth, fueled by the belief that your brain is a dynamic, adaptable organ that thrives on challenge. We have explored the mechanics of this growth, from the physical building of myelin in your neural pathways to the psychological power of adding the word "yet" to your vocabulary. We have discussed the necessity of leaving the comfort zone and entering the stretch zone, where mistakes are not signs of weakness, but the very blueprints for your future success. This book is essentially a call to action. It asks you to stop waiting for permission to be great and to stop waiting for a natural talent that may never arrive. Instead, it invites you to embrace the grind, to seek out feedback with curiosity rather than fear, and to view every failure as a black box opportunity for learning. The path to mastery is often messy, frustrating, and filled with plateaus, but it is also one of the most rewarding journeys a human being can undertake. It is the journey of discovering that the only real limits on what you can achieve are the ones you choose to accept. Remember that the most successful people in the world weren't born as the finished product we see today. They are simply the ones who refused to let the fear of looking stupid stop them from trying. They are the ones who understood that a 1% improvement every day eventually leads to a transformation that looks like magic to the outside world. They are the ones who chose grit over ease and process over perfection. As you move forward from this summary, I encourage you to look at your own life through the lens of the growth mindset. What is one thing you've always wanted to do, but were afraid you weren't talented enough for? What would happen if you stopped worrying about being a natural and started focusing on the process? The tools are now in your hands. You understand the importance of purposeful practice, the power of marginal gains, and the necessity of a supportive environment. You know that your brain is ready to grow, provided you give it the right challenges to chew on. The transformation from who you are today to the awesome version of yourself doesn't happen in a single leap. It happens in the small choices. The choice to keep practicing when you're tired, the choice to ask for feedback when you're unsure, and the choice to treat yourself with the patience and optimism of the growth mindset. Your potential is not a fixed quantity. It is an expanding horizon. Thank you for spending this time with me to explore these ideas. By simply engaging with these concepts, you have already taken the first step in rewiring your mindset. The journey to becoming awesome is officially underway, and the most exciting part is that you are the one in the driver's seat.